Welcome to Northwestern College in St. Paul, Minnesota, the site of the second North American Linnell family reunion in June 1991. As Linnell cousins from North America arrive on this 95-acre campus with well-manicured lawns, generous coverings of trees and attractive shrubs and flower beds, bordered on three sides by Lake Johanna, they were embraced by the beauty and serenity of the location, and they began to anticipate the thrill and enjoyment of meeting new and familiar Linnell cousins. It's a good, warm feeling. Checking into Robertson Student Center, you become at once part of the Linnell family reunion. From registration to room assignment, Linnells welcome you. The spacious Student Center area becomes the meeting and gathering place. During the reunion, the activities going on here beckon you. The family memorabilia on display invites you to browse, read, converse, meet family members, exchange information, and, in general, feel at home with family. From recognition of the oldest Linnell in attendance, 97-year-old Floyd John Linnell, to finding that 196 Linnell descendants were in attendance, representing 84 families from 18 states and overseas Haiti, discovery and excitement met you at every turn. We dined from a box lunch to a buffet to a full banquet, including al fresco on a beautiful Sunday morning. Gathering for a group family picture in front of Maranatha Hall brought home the realization of just how our family has grown, stretching to the far ends of the nation. Until our association, we were only small family clans, unaware of the richness of our heritage, the accomplishments of individual relatives, the joy of knowing one another. These will make memories that will last for years to come. The theater presentation you are about to see was prepared especially for this reunion by Dick and Drew Linnell and Pamela Linnell Dimlick. The main thrust of this presentation will be family history, stories, and recollections about the Linnells that migrated to Minnesota. Each story will be presented by a direct descendant of a Linnell family line that came to Minnesota. Two stories of the presentation will be first-person monologues about special ancestors: David Linnell, 1627 to 1689, and Abigail Linnell, 1832 to 1936. Dennis Linnell will be your narrator host as you see this program.
Our first presentation this evening will be a look at our beginnings here in America. Dick Linnell will portray David Linnell in the first-person monologue. The story is entitled A 17th Century Love Story, The Life and Times of David Linnell and Hannah Shelley.
At the first Linnell family reunion in 1988 at Barnstable, Massachusetts, Dick Linnell wrote and presented a 17th century love story, the story of David Linnell and Hannah Shelley. He was asked to repeat this story here in St. Paul.
I am David Linnell, son of Robert Linnell. I, David, begot the third generation of Linnells in America. My blood flows in all Linnell veins. When I first heard the notion that our story, Hannah's and mine, be called a 17th century love story, why, we thought that, well, that somebody was sporting us, and that I liked not. Upon reflection, though, a sudden will to tell the story of Hannah Shelley and David Linnell and the era in which our story takes place swept over me. So here am I, David, to give our account. Now, life in 17th century England, where I were born in 1627, were far from, well, from life today, or life in the colonies whence father brought the family in 1638, when I were a lad of 11 years. You know, I can still recall all the things that went on at that time, but I have tried to sift my memories for some recollections of my English youth. What comes most vividly to me is that, well, that our family were different. Father were a Puritan. I came to know that being a Puritan could mean persecution, jail as a nonconformist to the Church of England, or even shunning by one's own friends and neighbors. I still recall Father's distress at the arrest, the trial, and the imprisonment of the Reverend John Lothrop and some 40 of his Puritan followers. When the Reverend Lothrop was banished from the British Isles, Father thought to accompany him, but Mother's illness prevented him from so doing. Following Mother's death, Father married Penaya Howe. She was the sister of the Reverend Lothrop's wife. This marriage and, well, the continued persecution of Puritans in England favored Father's decision to join Reverend Lothrop in America. Now, I knew not why America, but I do bid as my father said. The full import of this decision of Father's did not become clear to me for several years. At that moment, as a lad of 11, a journey, a sea voyage, why, this overshadowed all. The frenzy of packing and planning and preparation went on for several weeks. As we boarded the ship for our journey to America, I was overcome with a tingling and excitement I still feel today. But once at sea, watching England fade into the haze, that excitement became fear and apprehension. We were at the mercy of the elements, the wind, the sea, the waves. Oh, life aboard ship was difficult. Many were sick. There was not much food. Not all survived the trip and made the landfall. But Father's faith was strong. His prayers were answered, and we Linnells, all of us, landed safely in the New World. You know, I have tried to recall the name of that vessel that we sailed on, and its name doth not come to me. The year of our arrival, 1638, there were some 20 vessels and over 3,000 individuals came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, Governor Winthrop had been recording all of these names and ships, but could not keep up that year. Therefore, history has not recorded the name, nor is it recalled by its passenger. After all, that were some 350-odd years ago. That's a rather far piece of time. I trust that you will not begrudge me some slight lapse of memory. Once we arrived in America, we journeyed to Scituate to join the Reverend Lothrop's congregation. Now, prior to our arrival, Reverend Lothrop and his followers had petitioned Governor Winthrop for more and better land on which to build the colony. The following year, 1639, we removed to Cape Cod, to the place we called Barnstable. Oh, there were much work to be done. They had to prepare for that harsh winter ahead of us. We worked from first light of day till the last of the afternoon. However, the Sabbaths were holy. All work ceased. It was a day for worship, for prayer, for meditation, reflection. Church were held all of the morning, and all were bid attend. However, we read the scripture every day at home. Father started the day this way. All family members took part. My formal education in America ceased except for this reading of scripture. Reading were a virtue, and I could read and write. Father had said that God had sifted the whole English nation to plant these choice seeds, the Puritans, in the New World. The question were, would they raise or grow a people worthy of him? Now, the Puritans, even after they arrived here, continued this sifting and weeding out the weak stock. came to be that over 2/3 of the population were debarred from church membership. But all those who were members and those who were debarred from church member were required to conform to the same moral code. This moral code was strict, demanding, and sinners were severely dealt with. For example, a sea captain had been at sea for about 3 years. He returned home on the Sabbath. He went toward the church to meet his family. He met them coming from church on the thoroughfare. Children run up and embraced him, and father was so happy to see them. Then he turned, embraced his wife, and kissed her. For this display of public lewdness, kissing his wife in public, the captain were brought before the magistrate and sentenced to 4 hours in the stocks. Rather severe. You know, the building of Barnstable, the establishing of it, was also the establishing of our church. For the church was the center of life and controlled the community. The freemen of Barnstable were quite concerned at this time, too, about Indian uprisings. They thought to raise a force for defense of the community, a grave responsibility. On the 27th of September, 1642, the free men of Barnstable met in assembly and raised a troop of 32 men. My father, Robert Linnell, was one of those who enlisted. After the enlistment of the 32 men, they elected as their commander-in-chief Captain Miles Standish. Oh, when I saw this going on, how I wanted to add my name to that list in defense of our community. The next year, 1643, as I turned a lad of 16 years, I too added my name to those who stood in defense of the community. You know, the building of Barnstable, or of any community, rather relied upon its churches, its homes, and its families. Early marriages were encouraged. After all, a bounty of children would give growth to the colony and strength to the colony. Why were it then that I delayed until my 26th year to marry? Well, my first responsibility was to father. The rigors of the passage to America, the changing from London City to tilling the soil in the New World, the everyday life here was sometimes very difficult for a man advancing beyond 60 years of age. Until such time that I felt that father's home were established, I continued to assist him. Also, my father's wife, now she were my stepmother, rather begrudged my position in the household. Moreover, there were Hannah. In my 24th year, I started to notice Hannah Shelley. Oh, we talked only at church. We spoke about home and family and church, and one thing led to another, and we started then telling about and talking about how we would spend our life, the things we could do together. Hannah and I were becoming serious. Now, Hannah could have had her choice of suitors, but I prevailed. And then the blow to both of us. Hannah and I were summoned to appear before a meeting of the church. Now, at this time, our church leaders, lawmakers, they were drawing up exhaustive lists of what they call prohibited carnal delights. Now, such things as kissing in public, or dancing, or bowling on the green, or playing cards or quoits or dice, and one that always amused me, unprofitable fowling. What this meant was that we were a rather poor shot. Therefore, if you went out and were hunting and were wasting ammunition, you were sinning. What were this law that Hannah and I had evoked? said that if anyone shall make motion of marriage to any man's daughter or maidservant without first consulting the father or master so to do, he shall be punished by fine or corporal punishment, or both, at the decision of the bench. May 30, 1652, a day I shall not forget. Hannah and I appeared before the court and confessed our fault. We had broken a law. We had sinned. We had committed a public fame. But our fame had just begun. The grand jury for the colonies met in Plymouth a few days after the church pronounced its sentence on us and debarred us, Hannah and I, from church membership. The jurors from Barnstable or from any of the communities were compelled by duty and law to report any irregularities within the colony. Thus, the court, the grand jury, on 3 June 1652, sentenced Hannah Shelley and David Linnell to be publicly whipped in Barnstable on 8 June 1652. Following the infamy of 8 June, Hannah and I healed our bodies, our minds, and our souls. But our love was strong. Our love survived. And in the spring of 1653, Hannah and I posted our marriage banns. Our marriage at this time were strictly a civil affair. Hannah and I appeared before the magistrate, Mr. Prince. We held hands and were pronounced man and wife in a very simple ceremony, plain, unadorned. The Reverend John Lothrop recorded the event, and Hannah and I begun our wonderful life together. In 1655, our first child, Samuel, were born. Love was within us and around us. We were part of the Barnstable community. In 1657, I pledged my allegiance to the crown and the colony. I had been serving in the Home Guard. I served on juries, and Hannah and I were one of those families of the building Barnstable. In 1658, Elijah, our son, was born. And then in 1660, Hannah, our first daughter, was born. 1663, January, Robert Linnell, my father, at age 79, passed on. Here was the Linnell that brought the family name to the New World, who was a devout Puritan. A great loss to me. It made my vow to make sure that our Linnell name was respected in America. And with the love, the understanding, the sweetness, the gentleness of dear Hannah, together we did. Our family continued to grow with the arrival of Abigail, Mary, Jonathan, John, and finally Susanna in 1673. This family of 9 children had some 50 Linnell and Linnell descendants. Hannah lived to see all of them marry, and some 40 of our grandchildren. During this time, the life in the colonies were changing some. The Puritan religion, its religious fervor, lost some of its sting and its sharpness. In 1681, Hannah and I were quite concerned because daughter Hannah were called before the church for her light behavior with one William Randall. However, Hannah were fined 20 shillings and released. Quite a difference in 30 years. This strong Puritan vision was softening. The last years of my life were spent in the comfort, the glow, and the love of Hannah, my family, our grandchildren, and Barnstable. I had survived a 17th century sea voyage, debarment from church, public whipping and shame, a marriage against all odds, and over 50 years in colonial America, with no blush about my name. I passed on at age 62 in 1689. My legacy? Acceptance of the Linnell family name in my adopted country. Linnell's sons to carry on the Linnell family line. My reconciliation with my church. Father had said that God had sifted the entire English nation to find choice seeds to plant in the wilderness. The question were, would they grow a people worthy of him? Father always said yes. Father were correct. As witness this wonderful gathering of Linnells this evening. My life in America were good. I wouldn't have missed any of it.
We are aware by now that our Linnell ancestors came from England to America and settled in Barnstable, Massachusetts in 1638. A rigorous voyage followed by an even more rigorous lifestyle, requiring a great deal of courage. Born of stalwart, trailblazing people, it is not surprising that 2 centuries later, the family is still following the urge to pass on to new frontiers and found their way to Minnesota. Why Minnesota? Prior to its admission to the Union as a state in 1858, posters such as this one were calling people to the territory of Minnesota. These advertisements and the Homestead Act encouraged people, including Linnells, to come to Minnesota. The land that was covered by timber, prairies, and lakes and more lakes. Wild game were plentiful. The land stretched from the Canadian border and the western end of the Great Lakes to the rich farmland of the south, was bordered on the east by the Mississippi and on the west by the still wilderness of the Dakotas. In 1858, a population of 9,000 was growing by leaps and bounds in this territory that at one time had owned its allegiance to France, England, Spain, the colony of Virginia, the Northwest Territory, the Louisiana Territory, the Indiana Territory, the Michigan Territory, the Missouri Territory, the Iowa Territory, and the Wisconsin Territory before it became a state in 1858. The routes that Linnells followed to Minnesota were the same that were as the others in the westward movement. It was a hazardous journey and one that had to be of hardy stock to make the trip and to survive. Travel was by water, covered wagon drawn by oxen or horses, or on horseback, or by foot. Railroads were not yet west of the Mississippi, and the Civil War was looming over the country. It was perilous, challenging, and an exciting time. This slide shows the routes of those Americans who left Barnstable, moved to Belgrade, Maine in 1781. His first son Samuel Joseph moved to Belgrade, Maine in 1781. his first son Samuel went on to Grindstone Island, New York in 1801. Later, this family continued west. The rest of Joseph's family stayed in Maine until 1861. Then the grandson of Sturgis, Samuel, came directly west to Minnesota. Within a year, the state became embroiled in a second war. In its own backyard, the Sioux Massacre. Native Americans, known as the Dakota or Sioux Indians, under the leadership of Chief Little Crow, rose to take the settlers in the Minnesota Valley by surprise. Before the Sioux Massacre could be brought under control, at least 450 and perhaps as many as 800 settlers and soldiers were killed. This was the Minnesota of our earliest ancestors and the Minnesota that they arrived in. We have discovered some Linnells in Minnesota, not from our Robert Linnell line, who came from Sweden. Their stories about the origin of the Linnell name vary among the family members. One family says that the name was a derivative of the name of a district where the family lived in Sweden. Another family that says when the great-granddad was coming through English customs, he was having difficulty getting his Swedish name understood. And looking upward for assistance, he saw a sign with the name of Linnell on it. And looking the official in the eye, he said, "My new name is Linnell." Our research has revealed 13 different family lines migrating to Minnesota in the 6 decades after 1861. The Minnesota map showing its counties indicates the areas of the state where the first Linnells to Minnesota settled. The very first was in Dodge County, and it was Samuel Linnell. The second to come was in Hennepin County, and it was Uriah Linnell. There are no descendants found today from Uriah. The third was in Becker County, Abigail. And the fourth to arrive was in Rock County, Charles and Clarence. Fifth in Faribault, Frederick. Sixth was in Todd County, Herbert and Clark. The seventh in Cook County, Malcolm, Edward, Peter, and Samuel Hiram. And the eighth was Bertha. No descendants found from Bertha yet today. This evening's presentation will highlight only the individuals listed on the map shown who migrated to and settled in Minnesota between 1861 and 1922. We will also mention the first Linnell born and the first Linnell who died in the state of Minnesota. There are many other interesting stories of later Linnells born in the state, but time does not permit their telling this evening. We trust our research has included all the Linnell family lines that came to Minnesota. If we have missed any family, please forgive us and let us know your line so it may be posted to the record. Today there are some 117 descendants of Robert Linnell living in Minnesota. These Linnells may point with pride to the fact that the first 7 generations of their family line lived in or were born in Barnstable, Massachusetts. The descendant chart now appearing on the screen shows the first 7 generations of Barnstable Linnells. We Minnesota descendants all trace our ancestry back to Samuel or to Sturgis, the 7th generation Linnell, shown on the bottom of this chart. The first Linnell to Minnesota came directly from Maine. This was Samuel. You will note that Samuel occurs frequently in our early family line. This Samuel, a grandson of Sturgis, arrived in the state in 1861. I am the direct descendant of Samuel. In fact, I am a descendant of George Linnell, who was the first of 2 sons born to Samuel in Minnesota. Descendants of those Linnells who migrated to Minnesota will present with both verbal and slide pictures the story of their ancestor, telling of their journey to and the life in Minnesota. To present Samuel's story, I give you his great-granddaughter, Althea Linnell Tremune of Blaine, Minnesota.
Samuel Linnell, my great-grandfather, was the first Linnell to migrate to Minnesota. Family historians say that Samuel arrived in Dodge County, Minnesota in 1860. However, as we were putting his story together, some questions arose about the various family versions of his arrival. My narrative will use some of these stories and the writings of my father, Floyd John Linnell, who has handwritten over 100 pages of his lifetime recollections. From this writing, I will quote frequently. Getting back to Samuel, we say that he arrived from Maine in 1860 with his first wife, Charlotte Gibbard Linnell, and their 2 children, Charles and Henrietta, better known as Sarah, in a covered wagon drawn by oxen from Skowhegan, Maine. About this trip, we know little except from Maine to Dodge County, Minnesota, is, as the crow flies, a distance of some 12 to 1,400 miles. Think of such a trip in a covered wagon behind a pair of oxen at, say, 8 miles a day. You're taking several months travel time, quite an undertaking. One might ask, why Minnesota? We can only speculate. In the 1850s, Minnesota was a land of opportunity. Virgin farm and timberlands were available, almost for the taking. For a filing fee of $2.50, a homestead could be established for 160 acres, or you could buy the land outright for $1.25 per acre. To a New Englander farming a few worn-out stony acres, Minnesota, on the edge of civilization, was the place to be. Minnesota was the frontier. 6 years before my great-grandfather came to Minnesota, there were only some 15 families living in Dodge County. Minnesota became a state only 2 years before his arrival. Yes, it was the frontier. Let's stir this first Minnesota Linnell family pot and see what happens. We find that Samuel Linnell came to Minnesota under an assumed name, Samuel Simmons. Why would anyone want to change such a great name as Linnell, even though Sam did take the Linnell name back prior to his death? More speculation and family stories. First, why did great-grandfather Samuel change his name? Was there some problem that caused him to do so? Some say they heard he lived in Canada for a while. Others say he came directly from Maine. Was he running away from something? We can only continue to speculate, or one can pass on the recollections of someone I have a tremendous love and respect for, my dad. I am going to do the latter with a couple questions and suggested change of one date. Most of my dad's recollections about his grandfather were handed down through his Aunt Sarah, or Henrietta, and from her uncle, Joe Gibbard. Samuel and Charlotte had 4 children, 2 born in Maine, Charles and Sarah, then George and John, born in Minnesota. Their last child, John Edward Linnell, was my grandfather. Dad relates to me that his Aunt Sarah told him a lot about her father, Samuel, and her mother, Charlotte, who died when John was about 3 years old. So John did not remember much about his own mother, Charlotte. Dad's story about Samuel's reason for coming to Minnesota is as follows, and I quote, "History tells us of the draft. If your name was drawn and you had money, you could hire someone to take your place. It seems that my grandfather and a neighbor, Hiram, had been drafted. Hiram and his wife were at the Linnell home, and his wife said to him, 'Hiram, if you are the man I think you are, you will be a long way from here by sunset tonight.' Hiram and my grandfather took to the woods and made their way to Minnesota." Again, let me speculate on Dad's recollections. First, if Sam and Hiram took to the woods and made their way to Minnesota, did Charlotte and the children come by covered wagon alone? Second, the Civil War began in April 1861 after the firing on Fort Sumter. The first conscription for Civil War service by President Lincoln was in the same month. Using this historical information, and as Sam was drafted, then Samuel Simmons Linnell arrived in Minnesota in 1861, and his reason to come west was to avoid military service in the Civil War. Dad's story continues with a memory of Uncle Joe Gibbard. Joe told a story of being in the pineries, as they called it in those days. We refer to it as being in the lumbering camps. Here we see Samuel as he looked about the time of this story. As Joe tells it, my grandfather stood over 6 feet tall, a large and strong man. This incident was over carrying a barrel of flour. Flour was packed in barrels, 196 pounds net. It seems that the camp was on a river, and all non-perishable supplies were brought in by water and stored in a warehouse on the river. One Sunday, the cook told 2 men to go down to the warehouse and bring up a barrel of flour. They remonstrated, "You don't expect us to carry a barrel of flour up the hill?" My grandfather kidded them and said he could carry it up the hill alone. Out of debate came a wager of $5 that Sam could not do it alone. As Joe Gibbard tells it, my grandfather put the barrel of flour on his shoulder and up to the camp and won $5. My dad continues, my father tells another feat he saw his father Sam do at threshing time. This was before they had weighing devices on threshers. Grain was measured in a half bushel as it came from the machine. When a half bushel was full, a lever was thrown to a second half bushel measure. 4 measures to each sack. 2 bushels weighed 120 pounds. My father said he saw his dad, Sam, stand in a half bushel and with one hand put 120 pounds, 2 bushels, on his shoulder. Samuel must have been quite a man and perhaps liked to show off a bit. Dad continues, my grandfather was not a farmer. In the summer he worked on construction, was a stonemason. In the winter he went to the woods. He had a weakness. He loved whiskey. When he drank, he wanted to fight, and my aunt, Sarah, said her father and a pal were always wanting to fight. If they could not find anyone who would fight, they would fight each other. My father must have had a rough time living with a stepmother. He says he can remember of eating his meals on a barrel in the corner. Dad continues, my Aunt Sarah was 13 years older than my father and was married when she was 16 years old. Her first husband was named Horde. They lived not too far from her father's home. Due to the abuse my father and his brother George received at home, when my father was around 7 years old, my Aunt Sarah took both her brothers and raised them, although she had 2 girls of her own. Samuel Linnell was killed in Fargo, North Dakota in 1894 and was laid to rest in Riverside Cemetery, Dodge Center, Minnesota. His tombstone states date of death was September 1st, 1894. Again, I quote my dad's recollections. Here is the story of his death by the hand of an unknown person. He was working in Fargo, North Dakota, and on Saturday night had to go across the river to Moorhead for liquor. North Dakota, as a state, had as a part of their constitution a clause no alcoholic beverage could be sold in the state. Sometime in the 1930s, this was changed, so now they have legalized liquor. My grandfather was found on the porch of the house where he was staying in Fargo with his throat slashed. The North Dakota authorities wanted $300 to investigate the murder, as he was a non-resident. My father did not have $300, so the murder was never solved. A tragic end to the life of the first Linnell to migrate to Minnesota. But one must look beyond Samuel's death, for his journey to this great state began a legacy of the family name in Minnesota. The growth and success of Samuel's descendants has been nothing less than phenomenal. Their contributions, not only to our state's growth, but to other states of the nation as well, can only be measured if one were to enumerate their present-day occupations and successes. A salute to you all. And to my father, Floyd John Linnell, a big thanks, Dad, for writing and sharing your memories with all of us.
Remember, I said earlier, the first 7 generations of the Minnesota Linnell descendants lived in or were born in Barnstable, Mass. This is true. However, one Linnell came to Minnesota that did not descend from the Samuel Sturgis family line. That was Uriah Linnell. Today we find no descendants of this Linnell. This chart shows Uriah's family line. His daughter Caroline left a lasting legacy at Carleton College here in Minnesota. As we are unable to locate any descendants of this line, Cheryl Linnell Kenny will present the story of Uriah and Caroline Linnell.
Caroline E. Linnell and her father Uriah were descendants of the Linnell line that Rachel Wind has named in her book Another Jonathan. The line with the letters in its identification number 11AB1. This is the only member of the family line we have found in Minnesota. Why and how Uriah brought his family to Minnesota, or what his occupation was, we are unsure. Uriah's death in Minneapolis in 1868 is the earliest known recorded death of a Linnell in Minnesota. Uriah must have been somewhat of a vagabond, as were many early Linnells, because in his short life of 38 years, he lived in 5 states. He was born in Palmyra, New York in 1830. In the 1850 census, we find him in Adrian, Michigan, where he was employed as a shoemaker. In 1853, he married Lucy Monroe in Chester, Pennsylvania. Their first child died in infancy here. Caroline, their only other child, was born in Grafton, Maine in 1856. After Uriah's death in 1868, we do not have much information about Lucy and Caroline, but it must have been a difficult time for a 40-year-old widow and a 14-year-old daughter. However, Caroline was an unusual young lady. She somehow acquired advanced education and became a teacher, not just a teacher, a college professor. In 1885, we find Caroline and her mother in Northfield, Minnesota, where Caroline continued at the college until 1904. Here her story ends, and we find no further family records. However, the archives of Carleton College provide us with this picture of Caroline and reveal this statement about her, and I quote, "As we have been permitted to know and love Miss Linnell, she has given us the desire to be more filled with love and peace. We feel that she lives in the world beautiful, believing that it is not only a privilege, but an absolute duty to live in the sweet, sunny atmosphere of serenity and light, in that love creates the world beautiful. She has attained the art of living by working out the simple obligation laid on everyone, to make the world somewhat better for his being. When one finds his environment in aspiration and generous outgiving, so that he lives in this atmosphere of sweetness and joy, he experiences it and radiates it. This Miss Linnell does." Caroline E. Linnell, one of the early Linnells to Minnesota, left the Linnell mark in the field of education.
Here we see Abigail, the widow of Sherman Linnell, on her 85th birthday in 1881 at the age of 49. Abigail came to Becker County, Minnesota from West Union, Iowa, with 3 sons. This family left a Linnell legacy in the state not duplicated anywhere. The Linnell family name was left to a town, a school, and to a cemetery. Abigail moved to California in 1891. This was Abigail at the age of 101 in 1933 with her granddaughter, Juanita Linnell. On July 8, 1990, a permanent plaque marker to the pioneers of Becker County was dedicated in the Linnell Cemetery. This marker was placed by the Becker County Historical Society on behalf of the Linnell Family Association in memory of Abigail Linnell and her family. Abigail will now visit with us in the person of Pamela Linnell Dimlick to recreate the remembrances of this remarkable woman.
Just what stories of our Linnell heritage might be appropriate for this reunion in Minnesota? As we thought about this and searched through Linnell information, the idea of a story about those Linnell families that settled in Minnesota began to emerge. The Linnell migration to Minnesota was the result. In the search for those Linnells that came to Minnesota, Abigail Linnell, the widow of Sherman, stood out. Thus, a trunk full of memories, the recreation of this remarkable woman's story.
A good evening to you. Oh my, look at all these Linnells. I imagine many of you have traveled some distance to come to Minnesota this evening. Of course, I've traveled quite a ways myself to be here. Ah, my steamer trunk arrived. It's just a trunk full of memories now, but we traveled some miles together. Do you know that I lived from one end of this great continent to the other in my lifetime? Born in Ontario, Canada, and I ended my days in California. And if the ocean hadn't stopped me, I might have kept going just to see what I could see. Oh, the things I did see. 104 years I lived. Do you know when I was born in 1832, Andrew Jackson was in the White House. The log cabin president, they called him. And when I passed on in 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was taking his New Deal around the country, and men were flying. 104 years. 10 of them here in this state. Now, that may seem a very short time for me to be the one asked back to your celebration, but we Linnells left our mark on this state. A school, a post office, and a cemetery with the Linnell name. Well, it was my family that put the name there. I knew Minnesota would be a ripe opportunity. Of course, my neighbors back in Iowa thought a 49-year-old widow lady ought to have more sense than to go traipsing off to such a primitive place as Minnesota was in those days. But like many Linnells, I had an impulse to move on all my life. But I'm getting ahead of my story. I told you that I was born in Ontario, Canada. Well, by the time I was 18, I had already traveled from Ontario to New York State, to Ohio, to Rockford, Illinois. In Rockford, I lived with the William Alexander family. I watched their 6 children, and I helped with the running of the house. Oh, there was a lot to the running of a house in those days. I was the first one up on those cold winter mornings, and oh, I shivered till I could get that wood stove started. Then I sweated over that same stove in August, putting food by. But I liked earning my own way, and there was this handsome boy in the neighborhood. Well, in 1853, at the age of 21, Abigail Doan married Sherman Linnell. We started our married life together, operating an eating establishment. Oh, Sherman was a fine cook. In fact, he later cooked for the officers' mess at the end of the Civil War. Our first son, Charles, was born after we'd been married 3 years. Sherman's father, Samuel, had been talking about going north to farm. And so when he decided to move to Sauk County, which is near today's Wisconsin Dells, we bundled up that new baby and off we went with him. We raised hops, which were used for the making of beer. Now, there were a lot of breweries in the area in those days, so we had a good market for our hops. They used to say, growing hops was the way to get gold without going to California. Well, many a farmer wished to set out a small hop yard, so Sherman sold hop roots. Well, our business grew, our family grew too. Frank was born there when we'd lived in Wisconsin about 4 years. Once again, we bundled up a new baby and off we went, this time to West Union, Iowa. Israel Earl was born there in 1862. This time we didn't move, but oh, our lives changed. We could no longer resist being caught up in the Civil War, you see. Sherman enlisted in the Iowa Cavalry. Oh, we waved bravely as they rode off to duty in the Southwest. That meant that Sherman missed those terrible battles of the Deep South, but his experience was an awful one. The Iowa Cavalry was divided into small squads, and they had to patrol large areas of land, scouting and fighting the rebel raiders. Well, they were cut off from supplies for long periods of time. Often they were starving. They had to live off the land. They slept in the saddle. Sometimes they fought off the ambushers, and sometimes they ambushed the rebels themselves. Many men grew ill under those harsh conditions, but there was no medical help. When Sherman came home to me, he was absolutely yellow with jaundice. He'd lost all his hair. Several times after that, I saw him prostrate, froth pouring from his mouth, sweat rolling down his face, his breathing terrible and labored. We had to hold him down so he couldn't hurt himself. He was a broken man. Long after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the Civil War was still killing good men. July 26, 1871. I remember that date all my life. Sherman had been out in the fields, and I was just getting dinner from the oven when he came home, and he said he'd go out to the barn to feed the horses. Well, I got dinner out, and he seemed to be taking a long time, so I called him. Sherman? When he didn't come, I went to the barn, and I found him there lying face down. Charles ran for the doctor, but Sherman was already dead when he came home. The West Union Gazette said that Sherman was quiet, considerate, and respected by all who knew him when he wasn't in his cups. That John Garkey editorialized Sherman's death. He said it was a lesson against the strong demon of drink. Arrogant. During the Civil War, he outraged half the county with his opinions. He thought the slavery question should be decided by local governments. One reader was so angry, he broke into the press room and took a sledgehammer to the press. And I'll tell you, after that wicked editorial, I would have swung that hammer myself. It was not drink that killed my Sherman. It was the Civil War and those terrible experiences. The government agreed with me. Many years later, I fought for the widow's pension owed to me, and I won, too. It took me 10 years. Sherman was buried in West Union, with all the honors due him as a veteran who fought to preserve the Union. I never in all my life met a man his equal. I had survived the Civil War alone with 3 small boys, but now the 2 younger ones were old enough to be a handful, and there was a new baby, my darling Laura, born the same year Sherman died. I tried, but by October, I just couldn't go on. I kept Charles and Laura with me, and I sent the 2 younger boys to the Soldiers' Orphans Home in Cedar Falls for a time. There were so many men killed, so many widows, so many fatherless children. Losing Sherman and later losing Laura, those were the great sorrows of my life. Oh, how welcome that little girl was after 3 active boys. I doted on her so. But when she was 8 years old, she grew ill, and we had to bury her next to Sherman. 3 years after that, Charles and his Julia named their first daughter Laura, and I felt that my child somehow lived on in my first grandchild. Frank named his son Sherman after his father, but that Sherman died too, killed in the war to end all wars. Wars still go on, and mothers and fathers and widows still mourn their loved ones. But life goes on too. With Sherman gone, I had to make my own way. I had already begun to do so, even before his death. When he came home from the Civil War, I bought a lot and a land in a good location just off the square, and I became a businesswoman. I had always taken care with my appearance, so I became a millineress. I sold ladies' hats. Mrs. Linnell wishes to inform her patrons that she is once again supplied with the millinery fashions of the latest and most improved styles. Ladies are invited to examine her stock, even if not disposed to buy. Oh, it wasn't easy. There was competition in West Union. Others sold hats. But I took fall and spring buying trips, and I bought back the latest goods. Look here, Mrs. Linnell wishes to inform her patrons that she has just returned from her fall buying trip to the East. She has dressmaking goods, latest millinery fashions, Wheeler and Wilson sewing machines. One time the paper said that my goods made the good one. Once the paper said that my goods made good-looking those who are handsome. We made a good life for ourselves, the boys and I, but I was restless, and the paper was full of news about land in Minnesota. Good, rich farmland, cheap, $1.25 an acre. And every day there were wagons going through town headed north. Finally, I had to go north myself. In the summer of 1880, I took a trip to Becker County, Minnesota. Oh, once I saw those trees and the lakes and the lush third shell prairie, I was won over. Can you even imagine today what it was like? There were trees and more trees, huge tall trees, and here and there pockets of prairie land that were good, easy farming because there were no trees. The grasses grew right up to my shoulders, and under my feet, the grasses from past summers made a mat that I sank into as I walked, and flowers everywhere. Everything seemed on a bigger scale than in Iowa. Well, when the time came to return to West Union, I filed a homestead. Section 4 in Carsonville, $2.50. What would I tell the boys? Well, I convinced them because next spring, when I came to stay, all three came with me. We took the train to Detroit City, and then we had to take the government Indian Trail. Now, when they cut those first roads, they left great stumps behind them. So we had to ride in two-wheeled carts because with four wheels, the rear ones would strike those stumps and brake as the horses picked a path between them. The wheels themselves were enormous to keep the axle high enough so that they wouldn't break on those stumps. The noise we made as we rolled along, 30 miles as the crow flies, but it took us 4 days to travel it. The trail was impassable much of that first winter, but there was plenty of game around, and so we were able to live off the land. Well, staples were in short supply, though. I remember learning to convince myself that a concoction made from boiled carrots was a good substitute for coffee. The next spring, Earl opened a trading post on part of our property, so we fared better that second winter. There was an Indian reservation just north of us, so we traded with the Indians and we traded with our neighbors. The next spring, we added a post office, and I became the first commissioned postmistress of Becker County. Now, in those days, trading posts and post offices were often named after the folks who ran them, so our area of enterprise became known as Linnell, Minnesota. That name stayed on the map until the 1920s. Today, just the cemetery remains. I made good money in Minnesota buying and selling land. Earl did too. He seemed to take after me, and he could turn his hand to anything to make a profit. He sold horses and cattle, insurance. He collected bad debts. He loaned money. He was elected deputy sheriff, clerk. He was a notary public, and he was a postmaster. He even got into politics for a while. But his great love was horses. He made quite a name for himself as a professional race trainer here in Minnesota and later over the whole country. You know, Earl was a great storyteller, but there were just as many stories told about him. One time he was having supper in the hotel down in Minneapolis, and a stranger with Irish-colored hair came in and sat down opposite him. Well, the stranger looked at Earl, who was quite bald, and said, "Guess you wasn't around when they handed out the hair, was you?" Well, Earl looked him right back and said, "Oh, I was around all right, except all they had left was red hair, and I wouldn't have any of that." Oh, he tickled me. We were so much alike. I guess he had my wanderlust too, because later his horse training took him all over the country and we just didn't see enough of each other as he grew older. In fact, his daughter Juanita spent most of her growing up years with me. That was her picture you saw before. Pretty thing, wasn't she? I finally did get to raise my little girl. Well, we made a good life for ourselves in Minnesota, but I was restless again. And there were all those stories about the good life in California. As the century turned, our whole family moved out to the West Coast, and I made a new life for myself in Long Beach with Juanita. Sold real estate again, but by the time I reached my 85th birthday, I decided it was time to retire from the professional life. But I still kept active. Oh, my Sunday school pinned for perfect attendance. Every Sunday, I walked to the First Congregational Church, and I taught Sunday school well into my 90s. I was rather proud of that. I was part of the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR. Lavender. I learned quite a bit about medicinal herbs at the trading post in Minnesota. To think of times when the train couldn't get to West Union for a week, the snows were piled so high, or blizzards where we were cut off for months at a time up in Becker County. And then in California, flowers year-round. Gardening became one of my great joys. My Oddfellows pin. I was an active member of that lodge until 1928. That was when I moved to Richmond to live with Charles and his family. I guess they decided 96-year-old Grandma needed somebody to look after her. I read the newspapers every day until my eyes failed. Now that annoyed me. But I could still get the news from the radio. I voted in every election once they passed the suffrage movement. And I let the warm California sun soak into my bones. So pleasant to doze in the sun. And think about the smell of lavender and the good baby smell of Juanita and Laura. And to think about the pines whispering around the lakes in Minnesota and the Indians coming right up to the trading posts wrapped in their blankets. And the boys in Iowa running through the haymow and making the dust rise up all misty in the light from the doors. And to think about hops and hats and Sherman.
Research revealed the names and information about those Linnells that settled in Minnesota. However, it fell short of telling their full story. A steady flow of communication with Linnell cousins brought forth much information. Some families and stories were harder to come by, but one source often led to another, with additional information or a long-forgotten picture. The stories you are viewing were the result of contributions by many, many Linnell cousins around the USA. Without their information, pictures, contributions, and encouragement, this story could have not been told. To all of you, our deep appreciation for being a part of the telling of the Linnell story.
Two of the Linnell migration to Minnesota. The map before you shows the Minnesota counties that the Linnells came to. These are the counties where the Linnell families we presented in Act 1, Samuel, Uriah, Caroline, and Abigail settled. In Dodge, Hennepin, and Becker. We will now turn to Rock County and Charles Linnell family. This family line is a little different and becomes, well, more complicated. Charles Linnell came to Laverne, Rock County, Minnesota in 1885 with his second wife and 4 sons of that marriage. 16 years later, in 1901, Charles' grandson from his first marriage came to Minnesota, to the same county and to the same town where his grandfather had lived. There are a few descendants of this family, but none here today. Fortescue, shown here, the son of Charles' first marriage, was born in Henry County, Illinois in 1859. When he was just 3, his mother, Nancy Allen, died. His father remarried in 1866. Fortescue was raised by a stepmother and his mother's family, spending his entire life in Henry County. As a young man, Fortescue began courting Anna Catherine Miller. Theirs was a love story with a bumpy courtship. Often while sitting in Anna Catherine's parlor, smoke would pour from the stove. When it became unbearable, Fortescue would say he may have to go home. As it turned out, Anna Catherine's brothers, obviously possessed with a perverse sense of humor, were putting a big book on the stovepipe. In spite of the brothers' efforts, whether serious or humorous, true love prevailed. Fortescue and Anne Catherine married on Christmas Day in 1879. Their only child, Clarence Garfield, was born on November 8, 1880. 4 months later, Fortescue became ill. He died when Clarence was only 10 months old. Fortescue was a successful farmer and left a considerable estate for Anna, which was said to have sustained his second family for some time. He also left a $5,000 trust fund for his son, Clarence. Quite an accomplishment for a young farmer who died at the age of 26 years. This slide shows Clarence during his Minnesota banking days in 1926. This turned out to be the largest mistake of his career because word got out that an employee of his bank was embezzling funds and the bank folded and Clarence lost all his money. After a year of unemployment, Clarence went to work at Northern Coal and Dock Company, where he worked until his retirement at age 67 in the year 1947. Clarence died in Minneapolis in 1952. It is interesting to note that Charles Linnell of this family fathered at least 8 sons, 6 by his second marriage, yet there are no male descendants of this family. The Linnell line from Charles' descendants only through the sons of this first marriage. Now let's turn to Cook County. The first Linnell to migrate to Cook County, Minnesota was Malcolm in 1910. His father, Edward, followed to the same location 5 years later. Both of these men were descendants of the 7th generation Samuel Linnell. To tell the story of these two families is the sister of Malcolm and the daughter of Edward, the oldest living descendant of this family, Laura M. Linnell.
My father, Edward Henry Linnell, was the son of Hiram Samuel and Azuba Linnell. He was born July 19, 1864, in Jackson County, Wisconsin. As a young man, he worked in the woods of Wisconsin with some of his brothers. He married Lysetta Green in the year of 1886. To them were born 5 boys and 6 girls. My grandfather believed in the teachings of the Strangites of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His wife, however, did not follow his teaching, nor did any of their descendants. Here we see my brother Malcolm in the mid-30s. He was the firstborn of us 11 children. In 1910, Malcolm, with his wife and young child, left Black River Falls by train and went to Duluth, Minnesota, and from there by boat to Holland, Cook County, Minnesota. Knowing that Malcolm was a surveyor and woodsman, his uncle Melvin Green, who had gone north earlier, influenced Malcolm in doing likewise. Malcolm was the first of the Linnell family to move to the reservation, as the area to become Middle Center was then called. He filed a claim for a homestead approximately 6 miles from the Canadian border and 19 miles northeast of Hovland. The first year they lived in Hovland. In the spring, Malcolm built his cabin, backpacking his building supplies to the site. When the cabin was finished, he even backpacked his cook stove to his new home. At that time, logging was the main occupation of the area. Logs were cut and driven down the Pigeon River, located on the Canadian border, to Lake Superior, where they were loaded on boats. Malcolm worked on the drive, as it was called, sometimes very dangerous work. Malcolm walked from his home to work at the logging camp, a distance of 5 miles or more. After working the week, he walked home after dark. One night, his wife, who was then about 19 or 20, was waiting his return when she heard a shot down the road from his revolver. She knew some animal must have attacked him, otherwise he wouldn't be shooting a revolver after dark. She grabbed the rifle and hurried to meet him in case he was in danger. She found that he had been shooting at some kind of wild cat. It may have been a lynx. The heavy timber was home for many kinds of animals in those early days. Early transportation to this area of the Pigeon River was by water or on foot. The homesteaders lived in one-room log cabins until larger houses could be built. These one-room cabins were crude, made of hastily hewn logs, a window or two, and a door. Most of them had board floors, but some had pole floors. Later, larger houses were built, some with better hewn logs, and in a short time, a lumber mill was operating and lumber was available. The houses lacked most conveniences. Water was carried from springs or creeks, and wood was cut and brought in for fuel. Almost all of the homes had telephones in service by the year of 1915. In the spring of 1915, my father, who was afflicted with asthma, went to visit Malcolm. As a result, he found that he became much relieved of his respiratory trouble. Being impressed with the fresh air and the country, he decided to take our mother and some of our family and our aging grandfather Green to the reservation. We boarded a train at Black River Falls for Duluth, Minnesota. We children were very happy to have a train ride, never having been on a train before. We didn't realize we would be leaving our Wisconsin home forever, but it all was exciting and new. As our train stopped at Bloomer, Wisconsin, we heard that a man had just been killed by a train, which shook us a little and took some of the thrill out of our ride. I think we gained respect for those big engines. As we approached the city of Superior, Wisconsin, Mother said, "You can see the lights of Superior." She had never gone any further north by train than Eau Claire, Wisconsin. When we arrived in Duluth, we stayed in a hotel overnight. We left the next morning on a passenger boat called America for Hovland, Minnesota, about 125 miles northeast of Duluth, where the boat docked and unloaded as passengers the mail and freight before going on to Thunder Bay in Canada. After staying overnight in Hovland, we traveled with horses and wagon about another 19 miles to Malcolm's homestead. Within a few days, we moved into a log house owned by our mother's brother until other arrangements could be made. The remainder of the family, who were still in Wisconsin, also came to Cook County in December of the same year, traveling in the same manner we had. But the temperature had dropped well below zero by this time. Later, the home in Wisconsin was sold and a permanent home was established in northern Minnesota, about 9 or 10 miles from Hovland. Dad bought a small lumber mill, which he and his sons ran for several years. Dad was good with figures and at estimating the board feet in logs. He never filed a claim for a homestead on the reservation land, but purchased land across the reservation river, which was then boundary line. This was my father in 1907. Dad loved to hunt and fish. It seemed he could catch brook trout when others failed. Once while fishing or roaming around the country, he came upon a little creek he didn't know existed. To his surprise, he found that it was teeming with lovely brook trout. Within a few minutes, he had all the trout he desired and came home for a fish fry. They were delicious, and we all enjoyed them and the story of his discovery. One day, a gentleman came to our home, and my father, always glad to meet people and feeling exceptionally good, began talking with this stranger and soon learned that he was looking for a good fishing stream. So Dad took him on a long hike through the woods to this little brook, which probably was a branch of a larger creek or river. The man soon had all the fish he hoped for and left. But before he went, he asked Dad the name of the creek. Dad answered with a glint in his eyes, "No Man's Creek." He was not about to give away his secret. Then, a summer or so later, another fisherman came and asked Dad where No Man's Creek was. My dad couldn't have directed him to that creek had he wished to do so. He needed someone who knew the woods. So the man left, never knowing where No Man's Creek flowed. Sometimes when asked how he could catch fish as he did, Dad would say, "Keep your bait alive and hold your mouth right." When the government bought back the land from the settlers for the national forest, people moved to other states and locations. The country reverted to its former condition, a wilderness. My memories of living on the North Shore are pleasant. My recalling them for this story has been an enjoyable trip into my past. Thank you for allowing me to tell you about them.
During the same year that Malcolm Linnell moved to the area known as the North Shore, Peter Maroney Linnell came to Cook County to check out the area and to do some fishing. Peter found the area much to his liking, so on his way back to Wisconsin, he too filed a homestead. Hazel Linnell Solander relates an interesting tidbit about Peter's move north. When Peter returned to Black River Falls, Wisconsin, and announced his intentions to move, he encouraged his brother, William, Hazel's father, to go with him. The enthusiastic Bill discussed this with his wife, Ann, who stood under 5 feet tall. She gazed up at her mate of 6'2" or better, having just given birth to their 10th child, Kenneth, and she said quietly, "You can go if you want, Bill, but the children and I are staying here." Bill gave up the idea. To bring us the tale of Peter Linnell will be his grandson, Hal Bakovich, who lives in Finland, Minnesota, in the area called the North Shore. Hal?
Thank you. Greetings, cousins. There are only 4 or 5 of us left who can remember Grandpa Peter, my Aunt Sis, Cecilia, and 4 or 5 grandchildren. As none of the rest came forward, I volunteered to tell a little about him. Now, I remember Grandpa very well for many reasons, but one incident in particular. Grandpa kept a pet bear, mostly for a tourist attraction in, okay, he's got the bear up the pole. Now, when he sold Pop for the bear, he had to feed it to him anyway, so he got him up that pole sitting on that board, his hand on the Pop. But this wasn't Pop, because the Pop give the bear the scoots, what wasn't desirable, so he just used Kool-Aid, more profit too. This bear was tied in a chain about 16 feet long and wore in a circle in the ground where it could reach. My cousin Joe and I were teasing the bear by running into the circle, and when it would run and chase after that one, the other one of us would duck into the circle, and the bear would take after us. Well, Grandpa caught us, and needless to say, we got a real good old-fashioned licking, raising some blisters, because them days, when you got a licking, your pants was down. Now I think, or rather I know, I absorbed more respect and love of that man in about 1 minute than most kids of today do in months, years, and some of them never learn it. Now I have some maps here. Well, this is a moot point now because I didn't get the slides made, so the maps are up in Robertson Hall, and if you want to look at them, you got to go there. I was supposed to have slides, and I'm just too slow at the draw. They never got made. The area of the reservation is approximately 3 townships in area, bordered on the east by Lake Superior and north by the Pigeon River, which is also the Canadian border, and on the Reservation River on the west. For all of the 40s that's in these maps up there that I've got colored in, I've got the patents as the original deed from the U.S. to the homesteader was called, or deeds. Most of them were from an Indian would acquire the property and sell it to a settler. The others that I hadn't colored in and the names are there either didn't prove up or I just can't find the records, and if they didn't prove up, they were squatters, so to speak. I also have a plot of the cemetery showing the plot owners and all the information I can get, and I need more. These are just the owners, and what I need is the names of each family's loved ones that are buried there. In some way, I'm going to get permanent markers on them. I'd like to see a plaque like we put at Ponsford last summer, but that's shooting awful high. That bugger cost $1,800. But I think I can make something cheaper than that. Got some shim stock, maybe I fasten on something and stamp on the letters, whatever. The other map up there shows government lots. Wherever that bordered on a body of water, the 40 wasn't a 40, it was more or less, so they numbered them in lots. So a lot of them deeds are made out lots 1, 2, 3, or 4, as the case might be on whichever bordered the water. And another one was a topographical map that showed all the rivers, lakes, and so forth. And the way I could pinpoint these settlers, there was 2 people that I could have got a hold of. One was Buck Smith, the other one was Marvin Smith. And I took 2 days with Marvin, and he plotted out, I think probably as much as 95% of the people that settled there, because he was the procurer for the community. There was no meat, so it was all roaming around. And he was the only good shot. Well, his dad was just good, but they had a 9-shell flashlight, and if they could get that light on a deer, it was venison. My grandpa's middle name, Moroni, is of Mormon background. Now, I checked out the biography of Joseph Smith, and the man angel that appeared before Joseph to tell him of the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon was written and where to find them was named Moroni. And as my great-grandpa was a Mormon priest, it was quite natural to use this name. None of Grandpa's descendants followed the Mormon teachings. You know, this past winter, there's lots of Arabs was named Saddam, and this same reason, worship, I guess, or whatever you call it. Peter came to the reservation in 1909 from Black River Falls, Wisconsin, to fish with his cousin Earl Roberts and look for land. Now, he didn't come to fish with a pole. They fished with nets, and they got lots of herrings. He wanted some green timber, but also some burnt over land to clear, as the green timber looked too tough to try to farm. He filed on a homestead in 1911 and brought his 2 oldest sons, Ted and Foster, and they built the 2-story log home. Okay, here we are. The family picture in front of the, I can't identify him here from here now, but maybe off the video you'll see him. Here we see Peter Linnell's family in front of the 2-story log home Peter and the boys built for the family. In May 1911, Grandma and 6 other kids arrived. They unloaded off the steamer America at Hovland. There was a dock at Hovland, but at headquarters where they wanted to let her off, she had got into a rowboat in the middle of the night, and that she refused. And incidentally, the steamer America ran aground and sank in Isle Royal in 1928, the same year Grandpa died. After getting settled at the homestead, garden planted and all, the men went to Hovland to work at a sawmill, much like this one. Now, we didn't get the slide switch because I found a negative of the mill that Albert Nederson had at Hovland. It was a steam-driven mill, and I got a slide for it, but we didn't get it put in here. So some of the men worked on the road. See, they were pushing the road through from the direction of Grand Marais to the Canadian border, and there was a lot of work there. Others fished on Lake Superior commercially using nets. They caught herring by the boatful, often a ton or more. And I might add here that I got the experience of going out with NASA Koss, my uncle, when I was really little. And I got seasick just on the way out to them damn nets, just like a poison pup. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. So he just pulled into shore and let me off, and I had to walk home a couple miles on them rocks. The fall of 1911, there are 11 kids of school age in the community, so after much talk with the school board, they agreed to furnish the teacher and books if the men would build a school. This they did. Here's the Birchwood School. It was one room, and later they added a little addition off to the side. It was a lunchroom and industrial arts room. And if you seen that little jumping jack up on that map in the corner up there in Robertson Hall, I made that when I was about 9 years old. So that little critter's 60 years old. He's been around. Pretty well wore out, but I got some copies made of him, and the way I got the original back, Uncle Ted brought it back about 25, 30 years ago and asked if he'd put the strings back on it. So I kind of conned him out of it. I asked him if I made him a new one, if I could keep that one, which he agreed to. So I made a dozen or more. But that's the original one. Getting to school in the winter was done in style. The first teacher, Blanche Woodard, was the first teacher, and Gertrude, Mrs. Arnold Linnell, one of my uncle's wife, was the last one. Well, that was just a wooden framework with some canvas on it, a little stove up by the front. And the door was quite narrow, probably about like that. And we had one lady in the community, she was about that wide. And she bummed a ride on the school bus. And now the driver, Donald Peterson, he told me this. He said she got stuck in that door, and we had a hell of a time to get her out of there, he said. You might remember Ethel Daniels. It took 2 chairs for that woman to sit on. She was huge. In 1917, Grandpa opened the general store at the corner of 10. Now, the corner of 10 don't mean much in this. It's explained a little bit. It's the corner of 10 and 11, 14, and 15. And that's right where the store was, in the corner. And it was the center of the community. Across the road from the store, there was the fellow who had lotted out in 20-acre lots. So there was, on that little circle, there was quite a few people. You know, there was a couple dozen anyway. And he was also the first postmaster, which was established then. Prior to that time, the store was 14 miles by team to Hovland, or 6 miles to Grand Portage by team, then by boat to Grand Portage Island, where Pete Gagne had the store. Now Pete Gagne said, I only have a 1% makeup on my goods. He said, I buy for $1 and sell it for $2. Now, Grandpa must not like that markup too much, because he established the store and run it himself. He ran the store till he died in 1928. Grandma ran it till 1930. Sold it to Godfrey Plant, and it burned in March of 1933. In the early days of the post office, mail came during the summer on the Steam America to Hovland and was brought to Mineral Center by horse and wagon. In the winter, it was brought 3 times a week by horse and wagon or sleigh as the occasion arose. And when the store got like that, by dog team. Now, with Grandpa out of the picture, things didn't go well in the community. The store burned in March of '33, and that about finished things off. And along about 1936 and up into the 1940s, the government asked the people to sell back to them. And they weren't offering much, but the logging had petered out. There had been several forest fires. The road was done. There was no more road work. And everybody couldn't fish. The ones that were fishing were the best off. But in the early 40s, then the government acquired all of the land. And they gave it back to the Indians, is what happened. They planted all the trees, tore the houses down, and if you go there now, there's evergreens that are 20, 30 feet high instead of an open field, and all around it is brush. So when all this acquisition took place, then most people moved away, or all. Some to Oregon, Louisiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, and such Minnesota cities as Rosebush, Lutsen, Good Harbor Hill, St. Paul, Duluth, Grand Race. In fact, they now live all over the country. The place once known as Mineral Center rests quietly, just a memory for those of us who knew it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. The state of Minnesota continued to draw Linnells. And in 1889, Frederick Linnell, the first of 3 brothers, arrived in Faribault County, Minnesota. Frederick was born to his father Joseph's first wife, Mary Jane. Later, his 2 half-brothers, Herbert and Clark, sons of Joseph's second marriage, joined Frederick. To present this interesting family story of Joseph and his son, Frederick, is Frederick's granddaughter from Cumberland, Wisconsin, Cora Linnell Hollinger.
Frederick Linnell was the son of Joseph Linnell and Mary Jane Linnell, who were first cousins. After their marriage in Wisconsin, they moved to Illinois, where Frederick was born. Family history is varied in regard to when Mary Jane died and how many children that she bore. There are few records to support the stories. However, Aunt Carrie's records indicate Mary Jane died in Henry County, Illinois in 1866, shortly after the birth of her 3rd son. Frederick was the lone survivor. Here is a picture of Mary Jane and Frederick shortly before her death. Records do point out that Joseph, a carpenter by trade, most likely moved to where he found work, which could explain that during his less than 60 years' life, he married at least twice, possibly more, lived in at least 4 states, and fathered at least 11 children. We do find records to show that after Mary Jane's death, Joseph went back to Wisconsin, where he married Sarah Welton in 1867. About Frederick's early life, information is sketchy. We believe his mother died before his 4th birthday, and his father remarried by the time Frederick was 5 or 6 years old. His formative years were with a stepmother who, it is said, treated him unkindly. This, coupled with the family's frequent moves and fitting into a family of stepbrothers and sisters, may have been the reasons Frederick was a quiet person who often stayed home and let his wife take care of family business. Frederick was trained as a carpenter by his father, but turned to farming as his life's work. He married and settled in Powersville, Iowa, near where his father lived out his last days. Frederick and Sarah, shown here in later life, moved to Winnebago, Minnesota in 1899. Here their 5th and last child was born. Later they farmed in Hewitt, where Frederick was joined by his half-brothers Herbert and Clark, sometime prior to 1914. In 1916, Frederick moved his family to Sebeka, Minnesota, where he farmed until 1930, when they moved to Becker County, north of Osage, on Straight Lake. During his lifetime, Frederick had often talked about his Aunt Abby, the Becker County pioneer, whom we met earlier. It may well have been that the events of Abby's life prompted his move to Becker County in his last years. Frederick enjoyed music. He played the organ by ear, would jig at the drop of a hat, and loved to dance. He was also a great storyteller. He loved animals and raised Hamiltonian horses and mountain shepherd dogs. He particularly liked cats, and one he taught to box. His hands were scarred as he spent time each day laughing and boxing with this particular cat. Frederick also became an excellent cook, and when Sarah and the children would go for the day, he always had a meal ready upon their return. This love of cooking is a trait that he has passed on to his youngest son, Hugh, my father. His descendants remember him as a loving father and grandfather, a pleasant, soft-spoken man, not given to false pretense. We look back fondly at this pioneering spirit and his role in the development of the state of Minnesota.
To continue the narrative of Joseph's family, Linda Linnell Baum of White Bear Lake, Minnesota, will bring us the story of her grandfather, Herbert. Linda?
My grandfather Herbert was one of Joseph Linnell's 3 sons that came to Minnesota from Iowa. He was born in Vernon County, Wisconsin in 1876. Just when Joseph moved his family to Floyd County, Iowa is unknown, but in 1891 a daughter, Lillian, was buried there. Herbert grew to manhood here and married Loy Gertrude Bonwell in 1904. Here we see Herbert and Gertrude during their time in Minnesota. They farmed their entire adult life. Their 5th and 6th children, Wallace, my father, and Ina, were both born in Hewitt, Minnesota. Grandpa Herbert had strong family ties, for when he moved to Hewitt, it was to be near his half-brother Frederick, his sisters Elfrida and Sadie, and his brother Clark. A story my Auntie Iris told me that she and my dad Wallace talked about recently was when the neighbors would hitch horses to their sleighs, put sides on them and put in straw and heated stones to keep warm, and go to Uncle Bill and Aunt Sadie's farm for wonderful barn dances. The men would run along and jump on the runners to ride. Some came 7 or 8 miles or more. They remembered the fun that the kids had and all the good food. In 1916, when Frederick bought a farm in Sabika, Minnesota, Herbert too looked for a new farm. He found his place east of Rush City near family living in Lindstrom. Herbert went to Rush City to establish the farm while Gertrude and the family stayed in Hewitt awaiting the birth of Ina. After her birth, Herbert returned to Hewitt and brought the entire family to Rush City in the Pine City area, where he lived until his death in 1943 at age 67. Health problems had plagued him. At the age of 53, he had a kidney removed. His death was the result of kidney failure. Herbert was exempt from service in World War I, but he joined and served in the Home Guard of Minnesota in Company F, 12th Battalion Infantry. He was proud of this service to his state and nation. My dad remembers his dad, Herbert, being called out often on Home Guard duties, such as the Hinckley and Moose Lake fires. Here we see Herbert as we grandchildren remember him. Our parents often spoke of Grandpa and Grandma as hardworking, self-sufficient farm folk. Many of the Linnell traits were part of Grandpa's makeup. He was a hard worker, had a quick temper, was a true taskmaster to his children, enjoyed music, and loved to dance. The radio was a great source of comfort in his last days. He was also an avid reader, especially of mysteries. Herbert and Gertrude, along with their children, Ivern and Bertha, rest today in Pine City, Minnesota. Their passion for life, their joys and sorrows, are testimonials to the ups and downs, the triumphs and failures of the spirit of all early Minnesota settlers.
To conclude the saga of the sons of Joseph Linnell, Paul Linnell of St. Paul will relate the life of his grandfather, Clark Linnell. Paul?
The following information comes from my grandmother, Cora Linnell's loving saved memorabilia, along with information from Clark Linnell Jr. Clark Linnell Sr. was born in Wisconsin, a son of Joseph and Sarah. Most of the early part of his life is still unknown. We do know he went to school only through the 5th grade, so most of his learning was self-taught. Clark met Cora Pendroy in North Dakota while part of a thrashing crew which worked the Pendroy Ranch area. Previous to his relationship with Cora, his fiancée had run off with another fellow. Clark quickly purchased a .45 and set out to avenge his lost love. He arrived in San Francisco just in time for the big earthquake and fire. He returned to the Dakota Prairie without exacting justice and became a sort of hobo on the way back for a while, but soon was working as a fireman to the railroad. We see Clark and Cora as their wedded life began in North Dakota, where their first 2 children were born. Clark repaired steam engines on the threshing machines. He's only about 5'5", but very strong and inventive. On one occasion, he had to dig a hole under the thresher because it couldn't be jacked up. He then braced his legs under the axle and with his back on the ground lifted the thresher while the mechanism was quickly repaired. Between 1913 and 1915, the family moved to Hewitt, Minnesota, where his brothers Herbert and Frederick were. Another son was born here. It is believed that it was while in Hewitt that Clark worked at a livery stable where he did a blacksmith type of welding, heating the metal and pounding it for specialized needs. One day a man came into the livery because he needed help with his car, which had quit running down the road a piece. So Clark hitched up the horses and hauled the car back to the stable. Now the owner's manual was in the car, and after studying it for a bit, Clark proceeded to fix the automobile. The next day, the livery owner put up a sign and advertised car repair and livery. And Clark had become a mechanic. Prior to 1917, the family moved to Mahnomen, where the Clark Linnell plumbing and heating business was established. Another son was born here. In June of 1918, the family moved to Detroit Lakes, where Clark was employed as a mechanic at the Motor Inn. In the fall, the two youngest boys, Merle and Jack, took sick with cholera and phantom, and by morning they were dead. Clark Jr., Clarky, was born on his father's birthday, and what a gift that must have been for Clark. In 1921, the family moved to St. Cloud, where Clark began working in the car shops at the Great Northern Railroad yards, and moved to a little house in the Pan Edition, named after the car manufacturer Pandolfo. Clark was sent to Minneapolis as a representative of the company to inspect the new railroad cars. He enrolled in classes at the University of Minnesota to learn about steel. During the Depression, the car shops were closed, and so Clark sold magazines and worked for farmers. Somehow he always put food on the table for his family. On the summer Clarky was 12, they were invited to help with the harvest on the Herbert's farm near Pine City. Cora drove Clark and Clarky over and left them there to help with the field work. Clark told his wife not to worry about them getting home back to St. Cloud. If no one at Pine City was able to drive them back, they would just hop a freight. Clarky was thrilled with this adventure, and Cora was not. Clark was paid $1.50 for his work, and Clarky was paid nothing. And after a dispute regarding the value of the scrawny 12-year-old's work, Clark called Cora to come get them. Clark returned to St. Cloud and began working at the Beeline car repair. One day he was offered the opportunity to buy into the new Beeline opening in Alexandria. It would cost about $250. Now Cora, who had been saving pennies in postal savings since their marriage, agreed that this would be a wise investment. In 1935, Clark became proprietor of Alexandria's Beeline service. During his spare time, Clark invented tools that would make his work easier using only the simplest of equipment. He also made custom parts for cars and machinery. Now Clark Jr., I've heard, and he told Georgia this, Clark Jr. is still using the driver's license he got at 10 years old to help his dad work on the cars. How he managed to touch the pedals, I'm not sure. Minnesota has yet to ask him to take the driver's test and continues to renew his license. Here we see Clark and Clark Jr. during the early days of World War II. In 1947, in failing health, Clark retired from the Beeline. On May 3rd, 1950, at the age of 71, Clark died suddenly at his home of a heart attack. And he was the last of the children of Joseph and Sarah Linnell.
The next descendant to Minnesota left no descendant, so I shall relate her story. In 1921, the daughter of William Franklin Linnell, Bertha Roby Linnell, came to Minnesota from Maine by way of New York State and Pennsylvania. Here she joined the staff of one of the state's leading colleges and became the second Linnell to teach at Carleton College. We also understand that Bertha's sister, Adeline Pauline, also came to Minnesota and was a teacher at Mankato State. Here we see Bertha when at Carleton. Bertha R. Linnell, affectionately known as Bert by her friends and several generations of Carleton students in Northfield, Minnesota. She was a professor of music at the college for 32 years, from 1921 to 1953. Upon her death in 1970, The Voice, the Carleton College student newspaper, said, "She was a beloved teacher with a deep concern for her students, upright and forthright. She had little patience with sham and incompetence, but she had charity for people. We can look with pride to a popular and remembered teacher in one of Minnesota's fine colleges where she helped mold the lives of countless young people during her long tenure in education." Our story of the Linnells began this evening with Samuel Linnell of the Sturgis line from Maine. We conclude with another Samuel, this one from the Samuel line that came through New York, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. To bring us this final segment will be the granddaughter of Samuel, Judy Speldy, from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
The year, 1922. Number 118-241-112, his wife and youngest daughter leave Wisconsin and migrate to northern Minnesota. Number 118-242-112, a name in a book to most of you, but to me, my grandfather. This distinguished, good-looking man in the picture is Samuel Hiram Linnell, one of the last Linnells to move to Minnesota. He was born, raised, and married in Wisconsin. Most of that time was spent in the Black River Falls area. In 1922, he left Wisconsin and followed his brother and stepson to Mineral Center in the northeast corner of Minnesota. How he traveled with his wife Lois and daughter Velma is unknown. I do know he had to depend on someone else for transportation because Grandpa didn't ever drive a car. Why he went is another question. What I can garner from those who knew him is that he probably went to Mineral Center just because it was there. Grandpa was always ready to move. My older sister used to ask him what nationality we were, and his answer was always the same. "You're nothing but a gypsy," he'd say. Now I realize this was his way of life, not really any family background that he was talking about. Sam was a laborer and worked at whatever job he could find. They moved from place to place often. Mother said she didn't ever complete one grade in the same school. When they moved, they took what they could get into a horse-drawn wagon. What wouldn't fit was left behind in a rented house. I remember him when I was a little girl and they lived in Grand Marais. I loved to go to their house. Grandpa usually sat in his favorite chair, and it seemed he was always reading magazines, big magazines like Look or Life. I know now that his reading was limited by a third-grade education. I suspect that what he was really doing was looking at the pictures. What he lacked in attachment to any location and formal education, he made up for it with a sense of humor and his unconditional love for his family. Grandpa and Grandma moved to a nursing home in Superior, Wisconsin when I was about 12, and although it was only about 120 miles from Grand Marais, I didn't ever see them again. He and Grandma died there in 1959, only 10 days apart. They're buried in a cemetery in South Superior. I wish he would have known this rich heritage that he was a part of. The year, 1974. Number 118-241-11287. Number 118-241-112-878. And number 118-241-112-8781. Leave Minnesota in a station wagon, and along with a U-Haul, head for Idaho. Elma Linnell Anderson, my mother, Judy Anderson Speldy, myself, and Jennifer Speldy, my daughter, claim those Linnell numbers and reside there in Idaho still. My husband, Mel Speldy, is there also. So the migration continues. Maybe Grandpa was right. We are just gypsies.
today was a result of contributions by many Linnell cousins around the USA. Without their information, pictures, and their encouragement, this story could have never happened today. To all of you, a deep appreciation for being part of the telling of the Linnell stories. I'd like to give some special thanks this evening to Dick and Drew for arranging this evening. Dick set up this whole evening this night, and Dick, could you come out at this time, and also your daughter Pamela, and also if Cheryl and Althea could come up at this time. We want to give you some special thanks for this hard work. He worked awful hard at this, folks. Let's give him just a great round of applause. There were also pictures and texts sent in by many of the families here, and these pictures and texts came from Juanita Linnell Moore, Lori and Thomas Linnell, Emily Baker, Doug Linnell, Carol Jean Anderson, Bonnie Featherstone, Mavis Linnell Solander, Eve Bakovich, Rachel Linnell Wynn, Mavis Linnell Palmquist, Roger and Bonnie Hanson, Marjorie Johnson, Carleton College, and Floyd John Linnell. We want to thank all of you. And a special thanks to our presenters this evening, many of whom were also contributors. Althea Linnell, maybe we can step forward one step as I announce your name. Althea Linnell Trimwin, Cheryl Linnell Kenny, Pamela Linnell Demlick, Richard Linnell again, Laura M. Linnell, Hal Bakovich, Cora Linnell, Linda Linnell Baum, Paul Linnell, Judy Speldy. We have everybody? Myself, Dennis Linnell. Thank you for attending. Thank you.
Presentation about Linnells, by Linnells, and for Linnells evoked reactions and emotions not anticipated. It gave one a new sense of family and a more in-depth look at a few of our cousins, and hopefully will encourage a thirst for more information about who we are and will generate interest and involvement for future Linnell Family Association gatherings. At our closing luncheon on Sunday, Linnells, sometimes emotional, expressed what the reunion meant to them. We all express our feelings and experiences in various ways.
I guess what it means to me, it's made me feel closer to my ancestry. Last night during the theater presentation, I had tears in my eyes, too much of it, because I wanted my grandfather to be there to see it, and I could see him sitting there with a smile on his face and enjoying it. And all my uncles, all of his brothers, and those that have passed on.
This reunion is an interesting thing in that you get to find out how more people have spread out over the nation.
Well, it kind of brings back your roots a little bit, and you learn about your family. I never did really know much about my family. This is the first reunion I've gone to.
It's been a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
I'm very delighted to be part of this here this weekend. I've been involved with the computers and enjoying that very much, working on the family genealogy and the computer operation.
And this is just a wonderful experience of continuing the tradition that we established 3 years ago and having everyone together to get to know each other.
I think this is a great place for a reunion, and we're looking forward to the next one.
It's just a great joy to meet all of my cousins.
I never realized until I came to this one how really important it is. Yeah, I'm just beginning to get interested in it.
But it's been fun being here, and we certainly have enjoyed the lovely setting here on Northwestern College campus.
I'm Dick Linnell, standing here at the site of our 1991
Linnell North American reunion, and we're closing down this Sunday morning after a delightful weekend. The reunion it's been a wonderful experience. I've been involved about 10 years with research of Linnell and Linnell descendants. Much of my time was spent on the westward movement of our family from Massachusetts to Maine, then from Maine to New York State, and then my family came west from New York State. And to follow those people and then meet the ancestries of those people at a reunion like this is just a heartwarming experience. And I think you have to be here and enjoy it to get that feeling. And once you get it, it's hard to get out of you. I think that you find that there are other members of this family that you don't know that are just wonderful people and delightful people, and it's just a big uplift to come to something like this. What we're looking forward to now is the 1994 reunion, which will be held in Granville, Ohio. We sure invite all Linnell and Linnell descendants to attend this reunion. We know it'll be a delightful weekend. Those that have been here have just enjoyed this atmosphere of meeting Linnell cousins from around the nation, and we sincerely hope that you too will take time to attend our reunion the last weekend in June, Granville, Ohio. Hope to see you all there.